My mother's father, Gib Rennie, was a gardener, and he grew up in the same small country village by the sea where his family had lived for generations. My mother's mother, Jeannie Harker, grew up in a mining community closer to Glasgow. Jeannie's mother died when she was very young, and as a result, my grandmother was taken out of school at age 12, and she was sent south to England to work in a scullery. And she suffered terribly from rheumatoid arthritis all of her life, becoming crippled at a relatively young age. And while her life was never easy, she persevered and she became a top-notch cook in her lifetime. She had opportunities to prepare meals for various members of the royal family, foreign dignitaries, and members of parliament. My grandmother had been sent off to England alone, put to work as a child, away from her family, forced to live and work with strangers. They call that human trafficking today, by the way. Thankfully, an older woman on the staff had taken her under her wing and tried to help her adjust to her new life as a servant. That woman's name was Alexandrina, and she went by Rina for short. My mother was named Rina in honor of this woman. My mother's twin sister was named Rona. Rina and Rona Rennie. My mother and her sister were born in the middle of the worldwide depression, and then World War II began when she was 5 years old. The war years were a period of tremendous deprivation and uncertainty for all people living in the United Kingdom. My mother's family was very, very poor. During the war years, my grandfather was trained to be an airplane mechanic, and this led to a lifelong career working for British aviation. My mother said that during the darkest period of the war, when it looked as though the Nazis might win, she saw her father cry once, the only time she ever saw him do that. He had come home after an 18-hour shift trying to repair airplanes without the adequate materials, knowing that these planes were not likely to make it back with their young pilots alive after running bombing raids on Germany. My Uncle David was born when my mom and her sister were 10 years old, and they had to help raise him as their mother was often bedridden with rheumatism. My mother married George Smith of Oban when she was 20 years old, and my half-brothers Ian Douglas and Grant were born in the middle 1950s. And during this time, my mother sometimes worked as a babysitter for an American couple, Bill and Dixie Steen. And Bill was stationed with the U.S. Air Force at Prestwick, where my grandfather worked. When Bill and Dixie received word that they were going to be transferred back to the U.S. to an Air Force base near Denver, they invited my mother and her family to emigrate, offering to sponsor them. My mother and George accepted. When the actual time came to leave, the Steens had to report an interesting development. While the offer to come live in America was still on, the transfer Bill had received from the Air Force did not have him going to Colorado, but rather to Sioux City, Iowa. And they thought, what's the difference? America. So my mother and her husband and her two young sons all emigrated to Iowa when she was 25, 1959. And they moved into a tiny house on a gravel road in the middle of relative nowhere, 20 miles south of Sioux City in a tiny town called Salix. I marvel at the adjustment this family had to make, moving from the west coast of Scotland with its sweeping views of the sea to the seemingly endless sea of corn, 1,000 miles away from the ocean, into a new life in the USA. My mother and George got divorced in the mid-1960s. My mother worked at the Sioux City Public Library, where my father, Andrew Hansen, was the head librarian. They were married in 1967, and they moved to Iowa City, where my father taught library science at the University of Iowa. I was born there in 1968. When I was 3 years old, my father established his career with the American Library Association in Chicago and moved to Wilmette in 1971, where I grew up. For almost 25 years, my mom worked overnight at a telephone answering service, there you are, Sue, in Wilmette and later in Deerfield. And after that, she worked at the Glenview Public Library, and then most happily, for several more years at the Northbrook Public Library, before retiring, where she made many good friends and enjoyed her job. My mother was loyal and kind-hearted to a fault. She was passionate about politics, and she believed in fairness and honesty as a way of life. She had a very strong work ethic, She was opinionated, she was stubborn, and she spoke truth to power without flinching. She was my advocate when people from the school system didn't treat me right. She found herself in tense situations with co-workers and bosses by speaking her mind. My father would sometimes be shocked by her stories from work, but I was always proud of her spirit and her fearlessness. She taught me that when you know you are right, you stand in your truth, no matter what it costs you in the moment, or what title your adversary goes by. It will always exact more from you in the long run if you aren't true to yourself when the moment calls for it. My mother was preceded in death by her parents, her younger brother David, both of her husbands, George and Andrew, and by her son, Ian Douglas. She is survived by her sister Rona, who lives in England, her son Grant, who lives in Scotland or somewhere, myself, 2 grandsons, Brandon and Dustin, and 5 great-grandchildren, Evan, Tatum, Dylan, Brooke, and Kyla, who all live in Kansas City. Her favorite charity was the Paralyzed Veterans of America, so please consider making donations in her name. Before I step away, I want to say you're in for a special treat. But first, I want to give a shout out to my dear friend Andy Johnson. At some point a couple years ago, I had said to my mom that I had a friend that I wanted to invite to come live with us because I thought that under the circumstances it made good sense for all parties involved. And she said, why not? We have plenty of room. And this was before she got sick. Andy had been a conscientious, warm, friendly, and very helpful housemate up until then, but then he really stepped up. My work does not lend itself to working from home every day. And there were many times when I was able to call upon and count on Andy to help me with my mom's needs when I could not be there. She came to love him as much as I do. And I know she was as grateful to have him living with us as I was. And my undying gratitude, my heart goes out to this fine gentleman. My mother and I would not have asked for a more welcome addition to our home and family until the last year of life. Thank you. My mother came from a generation where women were not as free to do cool stuff or follow their own muses as they are today. Childbearing and homemaking were what was expected of them, and my mother's entire life was no exception. I always knew that my mother was brilliant and had excellent command of the English language. I did not, however, know that there was a single example out there in the world of her creative writing talent until the early 2000s, after she had attended her 50th year graduating class reunion in Scotland. Hamish McGregor, a classmate of hers, produced a school publication from 1951 with a short story that my mother had written. Interestingly, she wrote the story from the first-person perspective of a man. I think her muse recognized that the subjects of freedom, responsibility, that come with facing danger that her story, A Storm at Sea, is about. In that day and age when she wrote it, the story would only be credible from a male perspective. It's very sad for me to consider what else she might have written in her lifetime had her creativity been allowed to flourish and develop when she was younger. Annie will be sharing that story with us this evening in that glorious James Earl Jones voice of his.
Yeah, so is that working? No, it's working. Okay, yeah, Rena and I became really good friends about 6 years ago. Yeah, it's on now. Speak into it. We became friends. Neil and I started playing music together about 7 years ago, and we would descend on his mom's house in Northbrook, and occasionally the police would be called. And she would come and down and say, the police are at our front door. I didn't want him to send him down to where you are. I'm down here telling you to shut the hell up. We would shut up for a few minutes. The cops would go and start playing again. But I would fall asleep there. I'd sleep over there, and I'd wake up in the morning because I'm an early guy. It's 7 o'clock. Doesn't matter what time I go to bed. I'd start chatting with Rena, and I really met her then. And we started talking to each other, and we started knowing that we think about the world the same way. And we became really good buddies. And I'm going to miss her for the rest of my life. She was a dear friend of mine. But this was her story. She wrote this when she lived in Scotland. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, she wrote this when she still lived in Scotland. So I'm going to read this. It's called A Storm at Sea. A Storm at Sea by RinaRennieHansen. Storms are exciting. They are not so merely because they whip up human emotions. They have also the essence of destruction, terrible yet fascinating. The hard winters of the north contain many of them, and its people, small farmers, crofters, and the seafaring folk have learned to dread them. For a totally devastating one can cause irreparable damage, and worst of all, claim many victims, humans, as well as cattle and sheep. Only last winter there occurred one of the worst gales that Scotland had ever experienced. It had been a fine frosty day, giving promise of an early spring. Towards evening, however, it sprang up, gentle at first, then rougher and rougher, until it tore, raging through the hills, and over the rocks and racing through the dense forests. The small farms and crofts were the first to report any serious damage. In the case of one old man, it was learned that while he was in bed, he was very old and almost bedridden, the angry gale had burst through the frail windows. The poor crofter lived alone, and therefore at the first sign of the coming storm, no one had adjusted the shutters outside and done its best to make confusion out of the neatness, blowing and rending the thin, worn curtains and knocking over the cups, vases, and even chairs. So fierce was it. The ancient crofter had a weak heart and did not survive what doubtless seemed to him to be the end of the world. Farther along the coast there lived an elderly widow with 2 children. The elder, like her dead husband, was a fisherman. The younger, like herself, was a spinner who excelled in the weaving of fine tweeds. The son, little more than a boy, had not returned from the sea, and his mother, anxious and tearful, had she not already lost one to the cruel sea, had gone, despite the stricken pleas of her daughter, to the tiny harbor, clad in thick woolens and gum boots, and carrying a flask of hot tea and one of whiskey. Someone later reported seeing her standing on one of the steep cliffs overlooking the harbor. She seemed like a wild thing, her hair streaming crazily behind her, and the wind making playmates of her coat and scarf. What she had seen as she stood there frightened her, maddened her, so that she screamed and cursed loudly, but the wind ruthlessly swallowed her cries to a faint murmur. Desperately, then, she plunged down the slope towards the sea. She may have thought that she could save her son, for what she had seen was the wreck of a small fishing boat floating and bobbing helplessly in the greedy sea. At any rate, she dived in, striking out towards the wreck. But the sea, pleased to get an unsolicited prize, gripped her and with its merciless arms pulled her down. Fate is cruel and loves the world's inhabitants as a creator loves his theater and puppets, pulling strings at random without plan or consideration. The fisher's son returned home to his sister. His was not the wreck the anguished mother had seen. I could not remain indoors, for the insistent calling of the wind cannot always be ignored. I handed over my earphones to my wife and left her on guard at the small wireless station we used in emergencies like this. She knew I had to go down to the shore and said nothing apart from warning me to keep warm. I made my way to the beach and sat down on the old tree which had once stood so proudly on the grassy bank behind the gloaming sands, and which now lay broken in the dirt. The wet sand had clung to it, bringing with it hard, curious-shaped shells of almost perfect beauty. I gazed at these and wondered why such triumphant elements as storms could create beauty from fear and chaos. All round we saw the wreckage washed up, boards, smashed bottles, wet, black masses of coal and stone. This was fearsome yet magnificent. The strength of the storm was evident. The moon rose high, creating a bleary gleam on the restless waves. The storm was abating. I turned around slowly and took a last look. Everything shone. The sand lay clumped together by the wet yet gleaming. Gleaming like precious stones. The tiny shells glinted wickedly like cat's eyes, I thought. Even the air had been washed. It was pure and clear and unspoiled. I walked home, contented, although I realized that hard work was ahead, clearing and estimating damage, finding homes for the homeless, and other such important matters. I realized also what the storms meant to many, but I did not care, for I loved them and was happy. That was from Rena. Thank you. Rena was wonderful. You all know that. Especially you, library folks.
Hello. I don't have anything planned at all. I just want to say
that's the way to go.
Yes. I was graced with meeting Neil through the bagpipe band, and at some very dark times in my life, he offered a place to crash on his couch for a little while. He asked me to move in after.
I gave you a room.
He gave me a room, and after a couple different transitions from Wilmette to Northbrook, I got to live with Rena for 4 years, I think. And I've always, sorry I'm getting a little emotional, but she was always like a third grandmother to me. She would always tell me like, oh, you're too skinny, you're not eating enough, you're not doing. And we had a bunch of wonderful moments, including a couple of Burns night suppers that we tried to put together so that we can have a little Scottish in us. And I've always, everybody makes jokes that I always wanted to be more Scottish than I am, but
you're honorary.
We found one of our, I think the three of us found a favorite movie together. I forget the name of the movie, but it's the wine movie from California.
Oh, Bottle Shock. Was it Bottle Shock?
Bottle Shock.
Great movie.
We were sitting on the couch one day looking for something to watch, three of us, and we found this random movie and I said, let's give this a chance, and it turned out to be one of just a really special moment. And she was a really kind person, and she was always good at making you feel loved and accepted, and she always tried to make you feel good. Even when she was going through some tough times, she always would see how you were feeling, and it was always something that I thought was unique because that doesn't happen. But she was a really special person, and I'm glad everybody's here to kind of celebrate Rena. She was a gem of a human being. Just want to say that. Thank you.
So I just have to say something because most people that know me, I can't not say anything. Anyway,
Please say.
So I married into this wonderful family, and Rena was an awesome mother-in-law. I will dearly miss her. One of my best wine partners out there. Anyway, I have to just raise a glass to Rena. And happy heavenly birthday.
Spjarken ramir asherish, koshach kas steren drei. En mogalay nam mafok, sirim mohevan mograi. Vashinyok is vashin sporsan, weakness all us is lekai. Eravana sirim moch, smisken Spjarken ramir asherish, koshach kas steren drei. En mogalayv nam mafok, sirim mohevan mograi. Turahike kom fisker, yrkrah servin. Stehev daki iver staker, tokalorans tokalvain. Spjarken ramir asherish, koshach kas steren drei. En mogalayv nam mafok, sirim mohevan mograi. Spjarken ramir asherish, koshach kas steren drei. En mogalayv nam mafok, sirim mohevan mograi. Krishin skiner noch die Eike, gab meine Förde tjej blå. Sprishin kanya, gab en bebe, achemar, enigma. Spjarken ramir asherish, koshach kas steren drei. En mogalayv nam mafok, sirim mohevan mograi. Spjarken ramir asherish, koshach kas steren drei. En mogalayv nam mafok, sirim mohevan mograi.
Rena McDonald, Rennie of Troon, and Steve and I are going to play for you.
Jason Haure Galea Fatanye Skererendo Stuvaiulesh Klimo Semagay Ferenshin Seye Semagay Arenshinka Semagay Avinius Muenchen Kumbita Kalarum Kabra Semagay Arenshin